All right, here we are. Section 4 is on World War One ends. This is going to be a longer video because there's a lot to talk about and a lot to cover. So just bear with me as we go. Usually this is a 2-day lesson, but I'm just going to do this in one whole shebang. All right, so we're going to understand the sequence of events during the last years of World War One. Basically after the Russian Revolution now, and the United States has joined. So we're going to talk about the last year and a half or so of the Great War, as it was once known, the war to end all wars. It went by a lot of names. We're going to understand the Paris Peace Conference, what went on there, and who is involved, and then we're going to understand the relationships between Wilson's 14 points, the League of Nations, and the Treaty of Versailles, and the legacy of World War One itself. All right, so although Russia withdraws from the war, this gave Germany new hope and the chance to focus on the Western Front. When the U.S. enters the war, it provides the Allies with fresh troops and increased supply. With the United States entering the war, it was an advantage for the Allies because now there are new soldiers who are coming over who have not had to go through the trenches and do all that warfare and fighting and all the devastation that had come with this First World War, and that gives a big advantage to the Allies. So what Germany is going to do is, now that they're fighting on one front, they're going to basically put all their eggs in one basket, which is what you're not supposed to do, and try a last-ditch attempt to break the stalemate. There's going to be some battles. There's the Battle of Amiens, which is in France. There's the Battle of the Somme, which is in France. It's in Paris, kind of near Paris. And then there's the Battle of the Marne, which the first Battle of the Marne set up the trenches. This is known as the Second Battle of the Marne, and it will start in 1918. Now, the Germans launched their final offensive in March. The Second Battle of the Marne takes place in June and July in the summer. The German army lost two crucial battles. The first one was Amiens, and then the second one was the Second Battle of the Marne. There was a large number of troops, U.S. troops, who were beginning to pour into France. So German General Erich Ludendorff told his country's leaders that the war was lost and that they should sue for peace. So that's Ludendorff. On the left, you can tell he's German because of the hat he's wearing. He's got that spike there. And then this is the Second Battle of the Marne here. Okay, this is in July 1918, so you can see that purple line going across. That's kind of the trench, and then all the fighting is going on within there. So you can see Germany is on the right there. Brussels, that's Belgium. You got the Netherlands up there, and then France, with Paris being right there, obviously. Right there. That's Paris. So just that. The fighting is all right there. And basically with these offensives that are happening, the Germans are trying to push, but they're not going to get anywhere, and they're going to have to actually retreat back to where they were. And after they've been defeated a couple times, Ludendorff says we need to surrender or sue for peace. Okay, why do you think Ludendorff took the gamble of throwing all of his resources into a single effort? So basically, he knew that with the U.S. entering, that would give an advantage to the Allies. So may have thought that if he could take Paris before Americans had time to fully enter the war, the Germans would have a chance at victory. Now, that's some foreshadowing a little bit to the Second World War, because what happens is Hitler after he goes and takes Poland, what he's going to do is he's going to quickly turn his attention to Paris. And what's going to happen is he is going to go and take Paris in no time at all, and he will control France. And that was a big thing for World War II. So, in a sense, Ludendorff is correct by doing this, but his execution and how quickly the American troops move was not foreseen. Now, okay, the fighting ends. The Allies were unwilling to make peace with the imperial government of Germany. So what happens is the Kaiser at the time, William II, is forced to leave the country because we will not talk to William II. The Allies will not talk to him. A council of workers and soldiers took over civilian and military offices in the northern part of the country. And then the Social Democrats announced the creation of a democratic republic and signed an armistice that put an end to the fight. The armistice just means we surrender, basically. It's a formal surrender. The armistice for World War I went into effect at the 11th hour on the 11th day of the 11th month. So at 11 o'clock on November 11th, 1918, Germany officially surrenders, and World War I is over. So now after this, they're going to have to do some treaties. Now, the Social Democrats' policies were not well liked. And so what happens is some radical socialists form the German Communist Party and try to seize power. The Social Democrats will crush this rebellion. The Social Democrats are still one of the major parties in Germany today. The Communist Party doesn't really last, and when the Nazi Party comes in, that's a different form of communism and socialism and fascism and stuff, but we'll get there. And then finally, the Austro-Hungarian Empire will disintegrate. Ethnic groups within the empire sought independence. The empire broke into the nations of Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. And then those countries, some of those, Czechoslovakia today is the Czech Republic, and Slovakia and Yugoslavia is a couple of countries today also. Alright, so here's kind of what the landscape looks like at the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So that red border, that's how big the empire was. So it breaks up into Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, the Kingdom of the Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, so that's where Yugoslavia is. That'll eventually be Serbia, Croatia, Slovenia, Albania, Bosnia-Herzegovina. There's a whole bunch. Bulgaria, Sofia, you can see that right over here. That is where the whole thing started, right there. So, let's see. Yeah, that's how it'll be. These countries will change a little bit between the First and Second World War, but not too much. The other big thing that's going to happen is you can't see it, but this purple over here, that's the Ottoman Empire. That's also going to be broken up, and we'll talk about that towards the end here. All right, why do you think the German people acted quickly to remove William II? Well, it's because the Allies would not negotiate with him, and the people wanted a quick end to the war. This had been going on for 4 years. They thought it was going to be a 6-month thing. People were tired of fighting, and they wanted to get to peace talks quickly. Now, at the Paris Peace Conference, it says the big three, but really it's the big four that are going to meet. Woodrow Wilson is the president of the United States. He favored open peace agreements rather than secret diplomacy to achieve a lasting peace. He also favors self-determination, and what that is, that's the next point. Basically, liberty could be assured only by creating democratic governments and a general association of nations. So basically, self-determination is like they're going to create their own government and do their own thing, but then they're also going to be allied with each other, allies with each other. That would prevent small states from becoming the victim of larger states, which is what had happened in World War One or leading up to World War One. When it came to talks, Great Britain and France wanted a lot more than the United States and Italy wanted. Great Britain and France wanted to make Germany pay for the war. They wanted them to pay all of the damages. That's also called reparations or reparations, depending who you talk to. But basically, it's just paying back your debt from a war. France had suffered the most of the big three, or big four, because the trench warfare was mostly in France. Great Britain was, they're an island, so they were off to the side, and the United States was obviously all the way across the pond, as they say, or across the Atlantic. And then France also desired security against future German attacks, and now that's where it gets very complicated in the language of the Treaty of Versailles, with what exactly that means. All right, so here you go. So you have Woodrow Wilson is this guy. He is the president of the U.S. This is George Clemenceau. He is the prime minister of France. This guy is David Lloyd George. He's the prime minister of the United Kingdom, Great Britain, and then this is Vittorio Orlando. He is the president of Italy. Remember, Italy had switched sides. So basically, these two plus him are considered the big three, and then Italy is kind of like the fourth player. Now, because the Allies had competing goals, compromise was needed to reach an agreement. Wilson was kind of in charge of keeping everyone level because the United States had been involved the least. So we're kind of seen as more neutral compared to the others. Wilson proposed a League of Nations, and this was accepted only in return for territorial agreements. So basically, Wilson would get to set up his League of Nations, which was combining and having an alliance with other countries and that self-determination and stuff. But in return, Britain and France wanted more territory, which is going to be where the Ottoman Empire comes into play. The French also accepted a defensive alliance with Great Britain and the U.S. in exchange for a separate Rhineland. So basically, the U.S., Great Britain, and France are all going to be allies now. And defensive allies means if France is ever attacked by another country, Great Britain and the United States would come help defend. The Rhineland it's gone back and forth lots of times between Germany and France throughout world history, depending on empires and kingdoms and whatever else. But basically, it's a border between Germany and France. And they want this to be separate and kind of like a buffer zone between these two countries. It will not work. Okay, Wilson was in favor of self-determination because many of the problems in Eastern European countries were due to the presence of many ethnic groups with different goals in the same country. Self-determination would give each group its own independent nation under its own rule. This would eliminate ethnic conflicts within countries. So basically, you're trying to give every ethnicity their own country. Now, the Treaty of Versailles was terrible. It didn't solve anything, and that's why we had a Second World War. I'm not kidding. Of the 5 treaties that ended the war, the Treaty of Versailles with Germany was the most important. The War Guilt Clause, which is Article 281, I believe, declared that Germany and Austria were responsible for starting the war. Now, the Germans will argue this point And they'll say, well, it really wasn't our fault. It was Serbia's fault that they shot a guy, and then we just responded. So that you can kind of go back and forth on that. World War II, they had to take the blame and they deny it, and it's like, okay. But we'll get there. Germany absolutely started the First World War, or the Second World War. I mean, the first one, it can be argued, but when it comes down to it, did you really have to send all your troops to go? And it's like, no. And also, it called for Germany and Austria to pay for all damages incurred by allies as a result of the war. Now, Germany would finally pay off their debt from World War I in the 1990s. They are still paying World War II. But World War I, and what happened is there's going to be some treaties and other acts that are going to be written up, because what happens is Germany's economy goes in the tank. It is worth more. Their money is worth more to burn it than to spend it. It's better to use it in your furnace than to actually buy things. Their money is worthless. And so the U.S. is going to basically make it so that they only have to pay so much a year. And that's why it took so long to pay it off. But they did do it, and they are still paying for the Second World War, I believe. Germany had to reduce its military force. Okay, kinda. They do, but then Hitler builds it back up secretly without anybody knowing, so that doesn't work. Return of Alsace and Lorraine to France. Now, that is a very complicated region. Alsace-Lorraine is in France. It's like the upper right-hand corner, kinda. It's a whole, that's a mess too. That's gone back and forth. That'll work, but then during the Second World War, it'd be given back and then back again. Cede land to a new Polish state. Yeah, that'll work. So they try to basically make Poland. That's going to be taken back rather quickly. And demilitarize its land along the Rhine River. Yeah, right. That's basically, it's a river in Germany. You cannot have any military there. That's not going to happen. So you can see the Treaty of Versailles was very weak in trying to actually fix the problems that had happened. They're not going to be resolved or fixed, and as a result, that's why we have the Second World War. The Germans considered the Treaty of Versailles to be overly harsh, but their government accepted the treaty. They didn't have a choice. They were going to either accept it or, well, that was it. It's either yes or yes. Those are your options. Okay, which clause particularly angered the Germans? Okay, 231. The War Guilt Clause, which declared Germany and Austria responsible for starting the war. Article 231, known as the War Guilt Clause. Now, some legacies of the First World War. There were some new nation-states in Eastern Europe. Okay, under self-determination, many new nation-states were created in Eastern Europe, but there were a lot of compromises that prevented them from being created along strict ethnic lines. Sometimes it'd just be too small territories or too many countries, or some places there's a lot of diversity, things like that. Almost every European country had an ethnic minority, which would lead to friction later. Which is basically saying another world war. The Ottoman Empire was dissolved. The Allies had promised to recognize the independence of Arab states after the war. Some were overtaken by France and Britain as mandates. Basically, mandates means that as part of doing something else, they're going to get something in return. The mandates included Syria, Iraq, and Palestine. Which are all in the Middle East. They would all gain independence eventually in the 1900s. The war shattered the notion of a rational society. Everybody thought that we could just work things out rationally, not go to fighting. Out the window. Basically, the answer is, well, we're gonna start shooting each other and that's how we'll win. There were millions of deaths and destruction of huge areas of land, which led to question the which led people to question the that's not right. The idea of human progress. I'm not sure what that's supposed to say. Good one. Okay, anyway, areas of Europe were destroyed. This devastated the whole continent. With all the bombings and the no man's land and all that, it was awful. The economy spirals. Europe goes into the Great Depression, just like the United States, so along similar lines. People thought that they were making progress by not having to resort to this stuff, but obviously not. And it will take a second world war for people to finally realize that, okay, we need to not, because of the bomb, straight up, but they need to realize that. The war effort led to complete mobilization of countries' resources and people. The role of government in the lives of citizens increased all over. People learned that freedom of speech could be limited in the name of national security. If you don't support a country, you can be thrown in jail for not supporting your country and what they believe in, which is a big thing. Now, finally, before I finish up here, Wilson, with his League of Nations, it was obviously never formed. The Senate never signed the treaty, and in U.S. law, for a treaty to be recognized by the United States, it has to be signed by the Senate. Not done. Because, in part, when Wilson was touring around trying to get another election, trying to be reelected, and also trying to support the League of Nations, he had a stroke and died. So that was the end of that. Just thought I'd put that in there. A little U.S. history for you. Okay, now the World War One. It's known as the War to End All Wars, the Great War. But with what we're going to talk about in Chapter 27, is just that there was still so many problems. And with all these dictators that come to power and promising all these things, it's going to lead to power struggles again. And again, in Europe, actually, World War II is actually 6 years in Europe. It's only 4 years for the United States. It's 6 years. World War II is from 1939 until 1945, technically. So that's just a little tidbit there. So this is a long video, but it's got a lot of good stuff. If you need to break it up into a couple parts or whatever, that's fine.